On a dusty, wind-swept plain near the Onon River, sometime around the year 1170, a lone horseman was dying. He was a powerful man, a chieftain named Yasuge. Just days earlier, he had been the head of the Borjigin clan, a feared warrior who claimed descent from legendary warlords. But now he was shivering, his insides burning, slumped over his horse as he desperately tried to reach his camp. He had made a fatal mistake. He had trusted the wrong people. Days before, while riding alone, he had stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars. It was a standard steppe tradition, hospitality to strangers. But these strangers recognized him. They remembered old blood feuds, and while they smiled and passed the food, they slipped poison into his bowl. Yasuge managed to ride home, but as the camp came into view, he knew it was over. He summoned his trusted retainer, a man named Munglig, and gasped out his final order. "Go get my son." The boy was only 8 years old. He had been left behind with a neighboring tribe to work off a marriage debt. He didn't know his father was dying. He didn't know that the poison coursing through Yasuge's veins was about to shatter his entire world. That boy's name was Temujin. But the world would come to know him by a different name, a name that would eventually be whispered in terror from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. Genghis Khan. To understand how a terrified 8-year-old boy transformed into the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, we have to go back. We have to dig through the myths, the mistranslations, and the blood to find the man beneath the legend. Welcome to the story of the Mongol Empire. This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about survival, betrayal, and the utter restructuring of the medieval world. But before we get to the conquests, we need to talk about who we're actually talking about. Because here's the thing, you've probably been saying his name wrong. In the West, we call him Genghis Khan. This name entered the English language in the 18th century because of a misreading of Persian sources. If you look at the original Mongolian, the word is Chinggis, pronounced Chinggis. The Chinese adapted this to Chengiz, and the Persians wrote it as Chungjis. But Arabic writers, they didn't have a chi sound, so they wrote Genghis, and that's how we ended up with Genghis. In modern English, you'll see it spelled Chinggis, Chinggis, Genghis, or Genghis. But the man himself, he was born Temujin, or if you want to be precise with the Chinese characters, Tiemujin. His legacy is just as complicated as his name. To the Russians and the Arab world, he is often remembered as a backward, savage tyrant, a barbarian warlord who wiped out entire civilizations. But go to Mongolia today, and he is a god. Literally, he was posthumously deified. He is the founding father of the nation, the man who took a scattering of warring tribes and forged a state. Decades after his death, his grandson Kublai Khan, the guy who founded the Yuan dynasty in China, went even further. He gave his grandfather the temple name Taizu, meaning supreme progenitor, and the posthumous name Shengwu Huangdi, or Holy Martial Emperor. And if that wasn't enough, Kublai's successor, Kulug Khan, upgraded the title to a mouthful, Fatian Qiyun Shengwu Huangdi. That translates to interpreter of the heavenly law, initiator of the good fortune, Holy Martial Emperor. So, was he a holy emperor or a bloodthirsty monster? The truth, as we're about to see, is that he was both. He was a man who killed millions, yet created a system of unprecedented commercial and cultural exchange. He was a man who believed the shamanic supreme deity, Tengri, had personally destined him to rule the world. But getting to the truth of his life? That is a nightmare for historians. Here is the problem. The sources for Genghis Khan's life are written in over a dozen different languages, scattered across Eurasia, and almost all of them are biased. For his early life, the part we are covering today, we rely almost entirely on two Mongolian sources. The first is the Altan Debtor, or Golden Book. The bad news? It's lost. We don't have it. We only know it existed because it inspired later Chinese chronicles like the History of Yuan and the Shengwu Qinzhenglu, campaigns of Genghis Khan. The second source is the famous Secret History of the Mongols. This is the holy grail of Mongol history. It survived only because someone transliterated the Mongolian sounds into Chinese characters in the 14th century. For a long time, historians were skeptical. The 20th century sinologist Arthur Waley basically dismissed it as a piece of literature with no historical value. But modern historians disagree. Why? Because the secret history doesn't paint a perfect picture. It's gossipy. It's embarrassing. It tells us that the great Genghis Khan was afraid of dogs. It tells us he was indecisive. It talks about taboo subjects like fratricide and illegitimacy. A propaganda piece would have scrubbed that out. Because it kept the ugly stuff, we tend to trust it more. Then you have the outsiders. The Persians wrote a lot about him, but they were split. On one side, you have Minhaj-i-Siraj Juzjani, writing in 1260. He saw the Mongol brutality firsthand. He hated them. His history is basically a horror story. On the other side, you have Atamalik Juvaini, also writing in 1260. He actually worked for the Mongols. He traveled to Mongolia twice. He's much more sympathetic, and he's our best source for the Western campaigns. And then there's the big one, Rashid al-Din. In the early 14th century, Genghis's descendant, Ghazan, ordered Rashid to compile the Jami al-Tawarikh, compendium of chronicles. Rashid had access to everything, confidential Mongol files, the lost Altan Debtor, and even Kublai Khan's ambassador, Bolad Chingsang. But because he was writing the official history for the royal family, he had to censor the inconvenient details. So, to find the real Temujin, we have to triangulate between the Chinese bureaucrats, the angry Persians, the loyal servants, and the secret history. We also have reports from the Song diplomat Zhao Hong, who visited the Mongols in 1221, and the biography of the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din by his friend al-Nasawi. We even have later Christian chronicles from Georgia and travelogues from Europeans like Carpini and Marco Polo. It is a massive historical puzzle. But when you piece it together, a picture starts to form, and it starts with a kidnapping. The story of Genghis Khan doesn't begin with his birth. It begins with his mother, Hualun. She was a beauty from the Olkonud clan. She had just married a man named Chiledu from the Merkit tribe. As the newlyweds were traveling across the steppe, they were spotted by a Mongol chieftain named Yesugei. Yesugei liked what he saw. He didn't care about the marriage. He attacked. Chiledu, realizing he was outmatched, fled to save his life, leaving Hualun behind. Yesugei abducted her, bringing her back to his camp to be his principal wife. This act of kidnapping would haunt the family for decades. The Merkits would not forget. Years later, Hualun gave birth to a son. When was he born? We actually don't know for sure. Historians have been fighting about this for centuries. Some sources, like Zhao Hong and Rashid al-Din, say 1155. The History of Yuan says 1162. A minor source from a Yuan artist named Yang Weijin suggests 1167. Why does this matter? Well, if he was born in 1155, it means he didn't have children until he was over 30, and he was leading brutal military campaigns in his 70s. That seems unlikely. The 1167 date fits the timeline of his life better, according to sinologist Paul Pelliot. But most historians today settle on 1162. The historian Paul Rachnevsky noted that Temujin himself probably didn't know his own birthday. As for the location, the secret history says he was born at Delun Boldog on the Onon River. Today, both Dadal in Mongolia and a site in Russia claim to be the spot. But let's talk about the name, Temujin. According to legend, when Yesugei returned from a battle against the Tatars, he brought back a captive named Temuchinuge. In celebration of his victory, he named his newborn son after the prisoner. However, there's another layer here. The root word Timur means iron. Many linguists believe Temujin actually implies something like blacksmith. It was a name that carried weight, hardness, durability, and the boy lived up to the mythology immediately. The legends say that when Temujin was born, he came out of the womb, clutching a massive blood clot in his tiny fist. In steppe folklore, this was a sign. It meant the child was destined to be a great warrior. He would have blood on his hands. Others claimed his destiny was even more divine. There were whispers that Hoelun had been impregnated by a ray of light, a callback to the mythical ancestor of the Borjigin clan, Alan Gua. Temujin wasn't an only child for long. Yesugei and Hoelun had 3 more sons, Kasar, Hachiun, and Temugi, and 1 daughter, Timulun. But remember, this is a polygamous society. Yesugei had a second wife named Sochigel. We don't know much about her, but she gave Yesugei 2 more sons, Beta and Belgute. So, you have a camp on the banks of the Onon River filled with half-siblings, 2 mothers, and a father who is a powerful chieftain. The boys grew up learning the essential skills of the steppe, how to ride before they could walk, and how to shoot a bow with lethal accuracy. But beneath the surface, tension was brewing. Beta and Belgute were older than Temujin. In the hierarchy of the clan, that mattered. When Temujin was 8 years old, or 9 by Mongol counting, his childhood effectively ended. It was time to find him a wife. Yesugei took his son and rode out to the pasture lands of the Ongirat tribe. This was Hoelun's people. The Ongirat were famous for the beauty of their women and had a long history of intermarrying with the Mongols. When they arrived, they met a chieftain named Dei Sechen. He had a daughter named Berta. She was slightly older than Temujin, but the match was perfect. However, Dei Sechen was a shrewd negotiator. He knew that marrying his daughter to the son of a Mongol chieftain was a good political move, but he held the cards. Berta commanded a high bride price. Dei Sechen made a demand. If Yesugei wanted Berta for his son, Temujin would have to stay behind. He would live with Dei Sechen's family, working for them, effectively serving as labor to pay off the future marriage debt. This was standard practice, but it carried a risk. It meant separating the heir from his father. Yesugei agreed. He looked at his son, perhaps gave him a final word of advice, and then mounted his horse. He left Temujin with the Ongirat and began the long, lonely ride back to his own camp. He was riding alone, and on the steppe, being alone is dangerous. This brings us back to that moment on the plain. As Yesugei rode homeward, hunger set in. He spotted a camp in the distance. A party was underway. People were eating and drinking. Now, the laws of the steppe are clear. If a traveler approaches your fire, you feed him. It doesn't matter who he is. Hospitality is sacred. Yesugei rode in and dismounted, but as he sat down, he realized his mistake. These weren't friendly herders. These were Tatars. The Tatars were ancient enemies of the Mongols. Yesugei had fought them. He had killed them. He had even named his son after a captive he took from them. But the ritual of hospitality bound them. They couldn't just attack him with swords while he sat at their fire. That would be a crime against the laws of the steppe. So they used a quieter weapon. They recognized him. They smiled. They passed him food. And secretly, they laced it with poison. Yasuge ate. He thanked them. He got back on his horse. The poison didn't kill him instantly. It was slow. It gnawed at him as he rode. By the time he reached his family's camp, he was barely holding on. He collapsed. The great chieftain, the abductor of wives, the warrior of the Borjigin, was fading. He called for Munglig, his most trusted retainer. He told him what had happened. The Tatars. The poison. "Go," Yasuge rasped. "Go to the Ongirat. Get my son. Bring Temujin home." Yasuge died soon after. The camp was thrown into chaos. The chieftain was dead. His heir was an 8-year-old boy, living with another tribe days away. His widows, Huelun and Xochitl, were left with a tent full of young children. Munglig rode hard. He had to get to Temujin before the news did, or before someone else decided to eliminate the heir. He retrieved the boy. He brought him back to the Onon River. But when Temujin arrived, he didn't find a clan ready to support their new young leader. He found a power vacuum. He found ambition. The Borjigin clan looked at this grieving 8-year-old boy, and then they looked at his mother. They saw weakness. They saw too many mouths to feed, and no strong arm to lead them. Loyalty on the steppe is pragmatic, and as Temujin stood over his father's body, the other elders of the tribe began to whisper. Why should they follow a child? Why should they share their meat with a widow? This was the moment everything changed. The comfortable life of a chieftain's son was over. The nightmare was about to begin. But the worst was yet to come. The comfortable life of a chieftain's son was over. The nightmare was about to begin. You have to understand the sheer brutality of what happened next. In the harsh moral calculus of the steppe, a leaderless family is a liability. It's dead weight. The Taichiud clan, the faction that had been rivals to Temujin's father, didn't just walk away. They orchestrated a ritual humiliation. When the time came for the ancestor worship ceremonies, a sacred tradition where the clan honors the spirits of the dead and shares a communal meal, they deliberately excluded Huelun, Temujin's mother. She was the widow of their Khan, yet they wouldn't let her eat. They wouldn't let her pray. Then, the Taichiud struck the camp. They packed up their gears, rounded up the herds, and started to move out. The secret history of the Mongols gives us a heartbreaking image here. Huelun, desperate and furious, grabbed the clan's spirit banner and rode after them, shaming them, screaming at them to honor their loyalty to her dead husband. And for a moment, it seemed to work. A few families, shamed by her courage, turned back. But it didn't last. The Taichiud leaders whispered in their ears, "The deep water has dried up. The bright stone has shattered." In other words, Yasuge is dead. Move on. Even those few sympathizers eventually abandoned them. Now, there are some conflicting accounts here. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din and the Chinese chronicle Shengwu imply that Yasuge's brothers might have stayed behind to help. But let's be real. If they did, they didn't do much, because what followed was a decade of absolute destitution. Temujin went from being a prince of the steppe to a scavenger. The family, Huelun, her children, and Yasuge's other wife, Xochitl, were left with nothing. No sheep, no horses, no protection. They were forced into a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which, for the Mongols, was the lowest of the low. They didn't have the luxury of milk or meat. They dug for roots in the frozen ground. They picked nuts. They hunted marmots and field mice. They stood in the freezing rivers, trying to catch fish. This wasn't just poverty, it was a daily battle against starvation. And as Temujin grew, from a scared 9-year-old into a hardened teenager, the dynamics within this tiny, starving family began to shift. And this is where things get dark. You might think the external threats were the biggest problem, but the real danger was inside the tent. Temujin wasn't the oldest male. That title belonged to Beta, his half-brother. Beta was the son of Yesuge and his second wife, Sochigul. He was about 2 years older than Temujin. Bigger, stronger, and according to the laws of the steppe, he had a claim to be the head of the family. But it gets more complicated. Under the Mongol custom of levirate marriage, upon reaching adulthood, Beta would have the right to marry his father's widow, Temujin's mother, Hoelun. Imagine that. The half-brother you despise becoming your stepfather and the master of your fate. Tensions exploded over food. It started small. Beta would snatch a lark that Temujin had shot. He would steal a fish that Temujin's full brother, Kasar, had caught. It was bullying, sure, but on the steppe, stealing food is an act of dominance. Beta was asserting his authority. He was showing them who was boss. Temujin and Kasar ran to their mother to complain. But Hoelun, exhausted and trying to keep the family from tearing itself apart, scolded them. She told them they had no friends but their own shadows and that they needed to stick together to survive. Temujin didn't listen. In his mind, Beta wasn't a brother. He was an obstacle, a rival. So one day, Temujin and Kasar tracked Beta down. He was sitting on a small hill, watching the family's 9 horses. He saw them coming. He saw the bows in their hands. According to the secret history, Beta didn't run. He knew what was happening. He simply asked them not to kill his full brother, Belgute, and then sat there, waiting. Temujin approached from the back. Kasar approached from the front. They knocked their arrows, and they executed him. This was a taboo act. Killing your own blood was a crime against the spirits. When they returned home, Hoelun took one look at their faces and knew what they had done. The chronicles say she exploded in a rage, screaming at them, calling them dogs biting their own afterbirth, comparing them to wild beasts. But here's the twist. Temujin didn't kill Belgute. In fact, Beta's younger brother Belgute didn't seek revenge. Instead, he aligned himself with his brother's killers. He became one of Temujin's most loyal generals. This was the first sign of Temujin's terrifying pragmatism. He eliminated the threat, Beta, but kept the asset, Belgute. Around this time, amidst the violence and hunger, Temujin found something rare, a friend. He met a boy named Jamuka, another young aristocrat from the Jadaran clan. They were just kids, playing on the frozen ice of the Onon River. They exchanged gifts, knucklebones at first, then arrowheads. When Temujin was 11, they swore the Anda Pact. This is crucial. Anda means blood brother. In Mongol culture, this bond is often considered stronger than biological brotherhood because it is a bond of choice. They swore to be one soul, in 2 bodies. Keep that name in mind, Jamuka. He is going to define the rest of Temujin's life. But Temujin couldn't stay a kid forever. The Taichiud clan, the ones who had abandoned him, heard rumors that the boy they left to die was actually surviving. He was growing strong. They decided to finish the job. They hunted him down and captured him. But they didn't kill him immediately. Instead, they locked him in a kange, a heavy wooden collar that clamped around his neck and wrists, turning him into a prisoner who couldn't feed himself or even brush a fly off his face. They planned to execute him, likely during a festival, but Temujin was slippery. During a feast, when his guards were distracted by liquor, he swung his heavy wooden collar, smashing a guard in the face, and ran. He hid in the rush beds of the Onon River, submerged in the water with only his face showing. The Taichiud searched everywhere. One man, a sympathetic warrior named Sorkhan Shira, saw Temujin hiding in the water. He made eye contact, and he didn't raise the alarm. Later that night, Temujin crept into Sorkhan Shira's tent. It was a massive risk. Sorkhan Shira was terrified, but his sons convinced him to help. They removed the wooden collar, burned it, and hid Temujin in a pile of wool until the heat died down. After 3 days, they gave him a horse and weapons and sent him into the night. This is the pattern of Temujin's early life. Extreme danger, followed by his uncanny ability to make people, even enemies, want to help him. He had another stroke of luck soon after. When horse thieves stole the family's ride, a young teenager named Boorchu helped Temujin track them down. Boorchu was so impressed by Temujin's charisma that he left his own wealthy father to join Temujin as his first nokor, his first sworn companion. Temujin was no longer just a survivor. He was starting to build a crew. By the time he turned 15, or 16, accounts vary, Temujin was ready to make his move. He traveled back to the Ongirat tribe to find Day Sechen, the father of the girl he had been betrothed to years ago, before his father's death. Day Sechen was shocked. He assumed Temujin was dead, but he honored the agreement. He gave his daughter, Berta, to Temujin in marriage. Berta brought with her a dowry, a magnificent black sable coat. This was a king's ransom. It was worth a fortune. Temujin didn't wear it. He didn't sell it for food. He used it to buy power. He took the coat to Togrul, the Khan of the Kerait tribe. Togrul was a powerful ruler, a Nestorian Christian, and crucially, he had been an Anda, blood brother to Temujin's father, Yesugei. Temujin walked into Togrul's court, presented the sable coat, and said, in essence, "I am the son of your brother. I have returned." Togrul, who was constantly fighting off coups and needed loyal allies, was touched. He accepted the gift and promised to protect Temujin and reunite his father's scattered people. Just like that, the scavenger had a patron. He had the backing of the most powerful Khan in central Mongolia. But on the steppe, every action has a reaction. Years ago, Temujin's father had stolen his mother, Hurhalun, from a Merkit warrior. The Merkits had never forgotten that insult. They had been waiting for the right moment to take their revenge. Soon after Temujin returned with his new bride, the ground shook. 300 Merkit warriors raided his camp. It was chaos. Temujin, his brothers, and his mother managed to escape on horseback, fleeing up the slopes of the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, but they left someone behind. Berta, Temujin's wife, fell into the hands of the Merkits. They gave her to the younger brother of the man Hurhalun had been stolen from, treating her as the repayment of a debt. Temujin was devastated. He stood on the mountain praying to the sky, thanking the mountain for saving his life, but he was furious. He needed to get her back, but he couldn't do it alone. He called in his markers. He went to Togrul Khan and reminded him of the sable coat. Togrul agreed to help. Then Temujin reached out to his childhood friend, Jamuka, who was now a rising chief of the Jadaran tribe. Jamuka answered the call. "I will cross the high passes," he said. "I will bridge the broad rivers." Together, the three of them, Togrul, Jamuka, and Temujin, assembled a massive force of 20,000 warriors. They smashed the Merkits. It was a rout. Temujin rode through the chaotic aftermath of the battle, screaming Berta's name. The secret history says she heard his voice, jumped down from a cart, and ran to him. They embraced in the middle of the carnage. But there was a complication. Berta was pregnant. She had been a prisoner of the Merkits for months. When she gave birth to a son, shortly after the rescue, the timing was suspicious. Temujin named the boy Jochi, which means guest or visitor. Temujin claimed Jochi as his own. He never publicly wavered on that. But the whispers started immediately. Was Jochi the son of Genghis Khan? Or was he the son of a Merkit rapist? This question of paternity would haunt Jochi for his entire life and eventually tear the family apart. But for now, Temujin had his wife back. After the victory over the Merkits, Temujin and Jamuka were inseparable. They camped together for a year and a half. They renewed their under oath. The chronicles say they ate from the same bowl and slept under the same blanket. It was a golden age of friendship, but it couldn't last. Both men were alphas. Both men were destined to rule. And the step wasn't big enough for two Khans. The split happened in a weird, cryptic way. One day, while they were riding together, Jamuka turned to Temujin and said, Temujin didn't understand what he meant. He rode back to his mother and wife and asked them to interpret. Berta, showing her political sharpness, told him, Jamuka is tired of us. He is telling us to go our separate ways. We should leave, now, while he is sleeping. Temujin listened. That night, he and his followers quietly packed up and left Jamuka's camp. But here is the shocker. As Temujin rode away, a huge chunk of Jamuka's followers packed up and went with him. 41 tribal leaders, along with the great General Subutai, remember that name, he's important, defected to Temujin. They saw something in him. Jamuka was an aristocrat who cared about pedigree. Temujin was a meritocrat who cared about talent. He promised fair distribution of loot and a better life. And the shamans were starting to talk. They prophesied that the eternal blue sky had allocated a great destiny to Temujin. Temujin was acclaimed Khan by his followers. He was no longer just a tribal leader. He was a challenger for the throne of the steppe. Jamuka was furious. His blood brother had betrayed him and stolen his men. The tension simmered until 1187. It exploded at the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Jamuka gathered 30,000 men. Temujin rallied his troops. The two blood brothers met on the field of battle, and here is where the official narrative usually says, the hero wins. But history is messier than that. Temujin lost. Badly. Jamuka crushed him. To make a point, some sources say Jamuka boiled 70 of Temujin's young male captives alive in cauldrons. It was a horrific message. This is what happens when you challenge the rightful order. Temujin's army was scattered. He was defeated. And then, silence. For the next 8 to 10 years, Temujin almost vanishes from the historical record. From about 1187 to 1195, we have almost no idea where he was or what he was doing. Where does a defeated Mongol warlord go? Modern historians like Rachnevsky have done some detective work, and the answer is shocking. They looked at a report by a Song dynasty envoy named Zhao Hong. He wrote that the future Genghis Khan spent several years as a slave or a servant of the Jin dynasty in North China. Wait, what? Genghis Khan, the future scourge of God, washing dishes or serving tea for the golden kings of China. It sounds insane, but it makes perfect sense. The Jin dynasty often took in defeated steppe leaders, using them as border guards or mercenaries. It explains why the Mongol sources, who wanted to paint him as invincible, completely deleted this decade from their history books. It was shameful. It was humiliating. But it was also educational. If Temujin really was in China, he was getting a front-row seat to the workings of a sophisticated, civilized empire. He was seeing their walls, their weapons, their bureaucracy, and their weaknesses. He wasn't just hiding. He was learning. When he finally re-emerged on the steppe around 1196, he wasn't the same rash young commander who lost at Dalan Baljut. He was older, he was colder, and he had a plan to dismantle the old world, piece by piece. He had survived abandonment, starvation, slavery, and defeat. He had nothing left to lose, but the worst was yet to come. He wasn't just hiding, he was learning. When Temujin finally re-emerged on the steppe around 1196, he wasn't the same rash young commander who had lost everything at Dalan Baljut. He was older, he was colder, and he had a plan to dismantle the old world piece by piece. But the history books, or rather the sources we have, get a little murky on exactly how he came back. It wasn't a glorious charge down a mountain. It was politics. In the early summer of 1196, Temujin made a calculated move. He didn't attack his enemies. He joined a campaign with the Jin dynasty, the superpower of northern China, against the Tatars. The Tatars had been a thorn in the Jin's side, disrupting trade and acting out. Temujin saw an opportunity. He fought alongside the Jin, and for his service, they gave him a title, Cha'ut Kuri. It sounds fancy, but in Jurchen, it basically means commander of hundreds. It wasn't a kingship. It was a mid-level management position, but it gave him legitimacy. Around the same time, he helped his old mentor, Togrul, reclaim the lordship of the Kerate tribe. Togrul had been kicked out by one of his own relatives, who was backed by the powerful Naiman tribe in the west. By helping Togrul get his throne back, Temujin changed the dynamic. He was no longer just a vassal, he was now a de facto equal ally. But while Temujin was playing 4D chess, his blood brother and arch-rival Jamuka was making a massive PR mistake. Following his victory at Dalan Baljut, Jamuka had gone full tyrant. The sources allege that he took 70 prisoners of war and boiled them alive in cauldrons. 70 men, boiled. And if that wasn't enough, he desecrated the corpses of the leaders who dared to oppose him. This was a disaster for Jamuka. In the steppe, strength was respected, but cruelty, without purpose, that was fear. And fear breeds resentment. People started to defect. They looked at Jamuka, the Gurkhan, and saw a monster. They looked at Temujin and saw a man who, while tough, was fair. A wave of disaffected followers, including the sons of the powerful shaman Minglig, packed up their yurts and crossed the lines to join Temujin. But Temujin wasn't running a charity, he was building an army, and he had a long memory. Around 1197, he turned his eyes toward the Jurchen tribe. These were the guys who had insulted him at a feast years earlier and refused to help fight the Tatars. Temujin crushed them. He executed their leaders without hesitation. And then he did something that shocked everyone. To punish the Jurchen, he staged a wrestling match. He ordered his brother, the massive Belgute, to wrestle a leading Jurchen warrior. But this wasn't sport. It was an execution. In front of the crowd, Belgute snapped the man's back. This was a massive violation of Mongol custom. You don't kill people in wrestling matches. The author of The Secret History of the Mongols even wrote about it with open disapproval. But Temujin was sending a message. The old rules don't apply anymore. For the next few years, the steppe became a meat grinder. Temujin and Togrul campaigned against everyone. The Merkits, the Naimans, the Tatars. Sometimes together, sometimes apart. They were the power couple of the plateau. And the other tribes were terrified. In 1201, the panic set in. A massive coalition of dissatisfied tribes, including the Ongirat, the Taichud, and the Tatars, decided they had enough of the Borjigin Kerate domination. They gathered together and swore an oath to break Temujin. They elected Jamuka as their leader, giving him the title Gurkhan, Khan of the tribes. It was the ultimate showdown. Temujin versus Jamuka, round 2. But this time, the result was different. At the Battle of Yedikunan, Temujin and Togrul smashed the coalition. It was a rout. Jamuka, the man who wanted to be king of the world, was forced to go crawling to Togrul, begging for mercy. Temujin wasn't done. He wanted complete supremacy in eastern Mongolia. He hunted down the Taichiud, the tribe that had enslaved him as a boy, and annihilated them. Then, in 1202, he turned on the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father. He defeated them, and then he issued an order that would change warfare forever. Usually, after a battle, the victors would loot. They'd stop fighting to grab gold, horses, and women. It was chaotic. Temujin forbade it. He said, "No looting until the victory is total." He executed the Tatar clan leaders. He wiped out the aristocracy. But he took the common warriors and absorbed them into his own army. Among these new recruits were 2 men who would become legends. One was Sorkin Shira, the man who had helped him escape the wooden collar years ago. The other was a young warrior who had shot Temujin's horse out from under him during the battle. When Temujin asked who had fired the arrow, this young soldier stood up and admitted it. He didn't beg. He just said, "I did it. If you kill me, I'm just dead dirt. If you let me live, I will destroy your enemies." Temujin liked his guts. He renamed him Jebi, the Arrow. Jebi would go on to become one of the greatest cavalry commanders in human history. By 1203, the board was clear. The Tatars were gone. The Taichiud were gone. There were only 3 powers left: the Naimans in the west, the Mongols in the east, and the Kerate in the center. Temujin, trying to cement his alliance with Togrul, proposed a marriage. He wanted his eldest son, Yochi, to marry one of Togrul's daughters. This was a mistake. The Kerate elite, led by Togrul's son Sengum, were insulted. They looked down on Temujin. They whispered about Yochi's parentage. Remember, Yochi was born after Berta's kidnapping. Was he even a Borjigin? And lurking in the background, pouring poison into everyone's ears, was Jamuka. He told Togrul and Sengum that Temujin was a threat. He pointed out that Temujin was promoting commoners to high positions, subverting the natural order of the aristocracy. "He doesn't respect the bloodlines," Jamuka whispered. "He's coming for you." Togrul, old and easily manipulated, caved. He agreed to a plot to assassinate his son, Temujin. They invited Temujin to a feast, planning to ambush him. But 2 herdsmen overheard the plot and raced to warn Temujin. He managed to gather some forces, but he was caught off guard. The Battle of Kalakaljid Sands was a disaster. Temujin was soundly defeated. His army was scattered. His loyal general Boorchu lost his horse and had to flee on foot. His son, Ugade, was badly wounded, with a spear through his neck, and had to be carried to safety by a warrior named Borokula. Temujin retreated to the southeast, to a muddy, miserable body of water called Baljuna. He had hit rock bottom. Again. This is the moment that defined the Mongol Empire. Temujin was trapped. He had only a handful of men left. They were starving. They were drinking muddy water from the lake. They were surrounded by enemies. But looking around that campfire, Temujin realized something. The men with him weren't just Mongols. They were a motley crew from 9 different tribes. There were Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists. They had nothing in common. No blood ties, no shared religion. The only thing binding them together was loyalty. Temujin raised his hands to the sky and swore an oath. He said, "If I am able to achieve my great work, I shall always share with you men the sweet, and the bitter. If I break this word, may I be like the water of the river, drunk up by others. His men wept. This was the Baljuna Covenant. Historian John Mann calls this a proto-government of a proto-nation. It was the seed of the empire. It wasn't about tribe anymore. It was about the state. It was about merit. Interestingly, the secret history leaves this part out, probably because the author didn't like admitting that the core of Genghis Khan's inner circle was mostly non-Mongol. But they couldn't stay in the mud forever. Using a clever ruse involving his brother Qasar, Temujin lured the Karaite into a trap at the Jeja Heights. The battle lasted 3 days. It was brutal, bloody work, but in the end, the Karaite broke. Temujin had won. Togrul and his son Sengum fled. In a twist of poetic justice, Togrul, the great Khan of the Karaite, was killed by a Naiman sentry who didn't recognize him. Sengum ran all the way to Tibet before being killed. Temujin didn't just defeat the Karaite, he absorbed them. He took the Karaite princesses for his family. He took Ibaka as his own wife, and gave her sister, Sorghaghtani, and niece Dox to his youngest son, Tolui. Remember the name Sorghaghtani? She's going to be the mother of emperors. The board was shrinking. Now it was just the Mongols versus the Naimans in the west. The Naimans were powerful, and their ranks had swelled with refugees fleeing Temujin's war machine, including Jamukha. They prepared for war, but Temujin had spies everywhere. In May 1204, he struck first. At the Battle of Chakirmaut in the Altai Mountains, the Naimans were crushed. Their leader, Tayang Khan, was killed. His son Kuchlug fled west. We'll see him again later. And Jamukha had abandoned the Naimans right before the battle. He was running, hiding in the wilderness with just a few followers. But his luck had run out. His own companions captured him and brought him to Temujin, expecting a reward. Temujin looked at these men who had betrayed their leader. He hated disloyalty more than anything. He had them executed on the spot. Then he turned to Jamukha. According to the secret history, Temujin offered to forgive him. They were blood brothers. He wanted to start over, but Jamukha refused. He knew there could only be one sun in the sky. He reportedly said, "Let me die quickly, so that I may be at peace and you may be at peace." He asked for an honorable death, without spilling blood. Temujin obliged. Depending on which source you believe, Jamukha was either strangled with a silken cord or had his back broken. The rival was gone. The steppe belonged to one man. In 1206, Temujin called a massive assembly, a Kurultai, at the source of the Onon River. Every tribe, every leader, every warrior gathered. They raised a white standard with 9 horsetails, and there Temujin formally took a new title, Genghis Khan. What does it mean? Historians are still fighting about it. Some say it means oceanic ruler, implying he ruled everything as wide as the ocean. Others say it means fierce or righteous, but the implication was clear. Universal ruler. But Genghis didn't just want a fancy hat. He wanted to rewire society. He began a social revolution. He realized that the old tribal system was the problem. It was too fractured. So he smashed it. He introduced the decimal system. Every man between 15 and 70 was conscripted. The army was broken down into units of 10. Arban, 100, Jagan, 1,000, Minkan, and 10,000, Tumen. Here's the genius part. He deliberately mixed the tribes. He took men from the Karaite, the Tatars, the Naimans, and the Mongols, and threw them into the same units. You weren't loyal to your tribe anymore. You were loyal to your squad. You were loyal to your commander, and your commander was loyal to Genghis Khan. He created a military-industrial complex. Each unit wasn't just soldiers, it was households. They supported each other. If you deserted, your unit suffered. He promoted based on merit, not birth. His top generals, Bo-Orchu, Mukali, Subutai, Jebi, were given massive commands. Sons of blacksmiths and shepherds became the most powerful men in Asia. And to keep them all in check, he expanded the Keshig, the Imperial Guard. It grew to 10,000 men. These weren't just bodyguards, they were hostages. The sons of the commanders had to serve in the Keshig. It was a military academy, a government bureaucracy, and an insurance policy all rolled into one. If a general rebelled, his son in the Keshig was a dead man. From 1206 to 1210, Genghis was busy locking down his power. But the biggest threat came from inside the house. There was a shaman named Koketchu, also known as Teb Tengeri. He was the son of Munglig, the man who had married Genghis's mother. Teb Tengeri was powerful. He claimed to speak to the spirits. He had proclaimed Temujin as Khan. But now he was getting ambitious. He started whispering that Genghis's brothers were plotting against him. He targeted Kasar first. Genghis, always paranoid, almost imprisoned his own brother until their mother, Hu'ulun, stormed in and publicly shamed Genghis for turning on his kin. But the shaman didn't stop. He publicly humiliated Genghis's youngest brother, Temuge. Berta, Genghis's wife, saw what was happening. She warned her husband. This shaman is trying to split the family. If you don't stop him, he'll take everything. Genghis realized she was right. He still feared the spirits, but he feared losing power more. The next time Teb Tengeri came to court, Genghis gave his brother Temuge a nod. Temuge grabbed the shaman and dragged him outside. They arranged a wrestling match. They broke his back. With the spiritual authority now firmly under his thumb, Genghis looked outward. He sent his son Yoki north to the Siberian taiga. Yoki subjugated the forest tribes, securing the fur trade and gold mines. In the west, the Uyghurs, a highly literate sedentary society, voluntarily submitted to Genghis. They were the first civilized nation to join the Mongols without a fight. This gave Genghis access to scribes, administrators, and the Uyghur script, which the Mongols adopted. But the real prize was to the south, the Western Xia Kingdom, the Tanguts. They were a sophisticated state with walled cities, standing armies, and trade routes. The Mongols had been raiding them for years, testing their defenses. In 1209, Genghis decided it was time for a full-scale invasion. He smashed through their border fortresses. He captured the fortress of Wulahai. He marched all the way to their capital, Zhongxing, modern-day Yinchuan. But here's where the Mongols hit a wall. Literally. They didn't know how to take a massive fortified city. They had no siege engines. They were cavalrymen, not engineers. The siege dragged on for months. It was a stalemate. So, Genghis had a bright idea. He saw the Yellow River flowing past the city. He ordered his men to build a dike and divert the river to flood the city. It was a clever plan. But remember, these guys were nomads, not hydraulic engineers. The dam was poorly constructed. Instead of flooding the city, the dam broke in the wrong direction and flooded the Mongol camp. It was a disaster, but it was enough to scare the Western Xia emperor. He realized that these Mongols were crazy enough to try anything. The Xia emperor surrendered. He handed over tribute, camels, falcons, and his daughter, Princess Chaka, to be Genghis's wife. Genghis accepted the surrender and withdrew. He had forced a sedentary kingdom to its knees. He had secured his southern flank. He had wealth, resources, and an army that was now battle-hardened against fortified cities. He looked toward the east, toward the Golden Khan, the Jin dynasty, the empire that had executed his ancestors and ruled the steppe with an iron fist for a century. Genghis Khan had united the people of the Felt Walls. He had crushed his rivals. He had reformed his society. He was ready for the war he had been born to fight. But the worst was yet to come. Welcome back to Part 4. When we left off, Genghis Khan had done the impossible. He had unified the steppe. He had an army that moved like a single organism. And he was staring down the throat of the Jin dynasty, the Golden Khan, the superpower that had treated the Mongols like dirt for a century. Now, in 1209, the Jin throne was usurped by a man named Wanyan Yongji. Genghis knew this guy. He'd met him years earlier on the frontier, and to put it mildly, he wasn't impressed. He thought Yongji was weak. So, when a Jin envoy arrived in 1210, demanding that Genghis submit and pay the annual tribute, Genghis didn't just say no. He spat on the ground. He mocked the new emperor to his face, turned his horse around, and rode away. In the diplomatic language of the 13th century, that wasn't just an insult. That was a declaration of war. Now, on paper, this was suicide. The Jin dynasty could field 600,000 soldiers. They had massive fortified cities, gunpowder weapons, and endless resources. The Mongols were outnumbered 8-1. But Genghis had something the Jin didn't: intelligence. He knew the Jin state was rotting from the inside. And he had a score to settle, specifically, vengeance for the execution of his ancestor, Ambagai Khan, decades earlier. In March 1211, Genghis called a Kurultai. By May, the invasion began. They hit the outer defenses in June. And this is where the Jin's internal problems blew up in their face. The border fortifications were guarded by the Ongud tribe. Their leader, Alakush, looked at the Jin, looked at Genghis, and made a choice. He opened the gates. The Mongols breezed through the Great Wall defenses without a fight. Genghis split his army into a three-pronged chevauchée. This wasn't just about conquest. It was about chaos. They burned villages, plundered resources, and cut off the capital's supplies. The Jin army, plagued by defections, tried to stop them at the Battle of Huanazui in the autumn of 1211. But Genghis's general, the brilliant Mukhali, absolutely crushed them. But then, reality hit. In 1212, during the siege of Shijing, modern-day Datong, Genghis Khan took an arrow to the body. The siege failed. The Mongols were masters of the open field, but they still struggled against big stone walls. Most leaders would have retreated. Genghis adapted. He realized that if he wanted to break China, he needed engineers. Over the next 2 years, he created a specialized siege corps, recruiting 500 expert Jin defectors who taught the Mongols how to build catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers. By 1213, they were back. The Jin had heavily reinforced Juyong Pass, the gateway to their capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. It looked impenetrable. But the Mongol general Jebe, the guy who had once shot Genghis in the neck, pulled off a miracle. He infiltrated the pass through mountain trails and hit the elite Jin defenders from behind. The road to Beijing was open. Inside the Jin capital, everything fell apart. A general named Hushahu abandoned his post, staged a coup, murdered Emperor Yongji, and installed a puppet ruler named Xuanzong. The Jin government was collapsing, but the Mongols were exhausted. They had overreached. An epidemic swept through their camp. Famine was so bad that contemporary chroniclers like Carpini claimed the troops resorted to cannibalism, though that might be exaggeration. So, Genghis did something pragmatic. He negotiated. In May 1214, he agreed to lift the siege in exchange for a massive tribute, 3,000 horses, 500 slaves, a Jin princess, and mountains of gold and silk. Genghis took the loot and started riding home. War over, right, wrong. As soon as Genghis left, the new Jin emperor, Xuanzong, panicked. He moved his entire capital 600 kilometers south to Kaifeng to get away from the Mongol threat. Genghis saw this as a breach of their treaty, a sign that the Jin were regrouping to counterattack. He turned the army around. He sent his generals back to the north. By May 31st, 1215, the starving inhabitants of Zhongdu surrendered. The city of Beijing was sacked. It was a devastation so complete that travelers years later reported seeing mountains of white bones outside the city walls. Genghis returned to Mongolia in 1216, leaving Mukhali in charge of China. For the next 7 years, Mukhali would wage a brutal, grinding war against the Jin remnants until his death in 1223. But Genghis, he had new problems rising in the west. While Genghis was busy in China, his northern territories were getting messy. In 1216, a governor he'd appointed named Korchi, who was basically just a crony appointed for past favors, decided to start abducting women from the local tribes for his harem. Unsurprisingly, the tribes rebelled and took him prisoner. Then, in 1217, these rebels ambushed and killed Barokul, one of Genghis's absolute favorite generals and closest friends. Genghis was livid. He wanted to march north and burn everything down himself, but his advisors talked him down. Instead, he sent his eldest son, Jochi. Jochi crushed the rebellion and secured the region, proving his worth. But the real threat was further west. Remember Kuchlug, the Naiman prince who fled way back in 1204? He had popped up again. He'd usurped the throne of the Karakitai Empire in Central Asia. Kuchlug was a piece of work, a Buddhist fanatic ruling over a mostly Muslim population, forcing them to convert or face persecution. Genghis saw an opening. He sent Jebe with 20,000 cavalry. But Jebe didn't just bring swords. He brought freedom of religion. He announced that the Mongols would allow everyone to worship freely. The local population turned on Kuchlug instantly. Kuchlug ran for his life into the Pamir Mountains, but local hunters caught him. Jebe beheaded him and toured the region with Kuchlug's head on a spike. Suddenly, the Mongol Empire bordered the Islamic world, specifically the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmian Empire was huge. It covered modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. Genghis didn't want war. He wanted trade. He controlled the Eastern Silk Road. They controlled the center. It was a match made in economic heaven. Genghis sent a message to the Sultan, Muhammad II, "I am master of the lands of the rising sun, while you rule those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship and peace." In 1218, a massive Mongol trade caravan arrived at the Khwarezmian border town of Otrar. 450 merchants, camels loaded with gold, silver, and silk. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, got greedy. He accused them of being spies, massacred all 450 merchants, and stole their goods. Genghis gave the Sultan one chance to fix this. He sent 3 ambassadors to demand the governor be handed over. Sultan Muhammad II made the worst decision in military history. He killed the lead Mongol ambassador and burned the beards off the other 2, sending them back humiliated. You do not kill Genghis Khan's ambassadors. Genghis went to his sacred mountain, prayed to the eternal blue sky, and declared, "I am not the author of this trouble." He left Mukhali in China with a skeleton crew and turned the entire Mongol war machine west. Sultan Muhammad had a bigger army, but he was paranoid. He didn't trust his own commanders, so he scattered his troops into garrisons inside the major cities. He thought the Mongols would get tired of sieges and leave. He was wrong. This allowed the Mongols to isolate and destroy the cities one by one. They hit Otrar in autumn 1219. It took 5 months, but they breached the walls. Inalchuk, the governor who started it all, legend says the Mongols poured molten silver into his eyes and ears as punishment for his greed before executing him. Then Genghis did something brilliant. He split his forces. He sent his son Yochi north. He sent another force south. And then Genghis and his youngest son Tolui did the impossible. They marched an army across the Kizilkum Desert, a place thought impassable, to appear deep behind enemy lines. They popped up at Bukhara in February 1220. The garrison was stunned. The city fell. Then Samarkand fell. Sultan Muhammad realized he was doomed. He fled. Genghis unleashed his dogs of war, Jebe and Subutai, with orders to hunt the Sultan down. They chased him across Persia until he died of dysentery on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea, shivering and alone, in the winter of 1220. Jebe and Subutai didn't stop there. They went on what historians call the Great Raid, a 4,500-mile reconnaissance mission around the Caspian Sea, crushing Georgian knights and Russian princes, making contact with Europe for the first time. Back in the empire, things got ugly. The Sultan's son, Jalal al-Din, tried to fight back. He actually defeated a Mongol army at the Battle of Parwan, the only real defeat the Mongols suffered in this campaign. Genghis's response was apocalyptic. He sent his son Tolui to Khorasan, modern eastern Iran, Afghanistan, with orders to break the region's spirit. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in human history. The cities of Nishapur, Merv, and Herat, jewels of Islamic civilization, were annihilated. If a city resisted, everyone died. While ancient historians claimed 5.7 million dead, which is physically impossible, modern estimates still put the death toll around 1.225 million. It was a demographic catastrophe. Jalal al-Din was eventually cornered at the Indus River in 1221. He fought bravely, then rode his horse off a cliff into the river to escape into India. Genghis admired his courage, but the Khwarezmian Empire was erased from the map. By 1222, Genghis was tired. He considered invading India to get back to Mongolia, but realized the heat and humidity were destroying his troops. Plus, the omens were bad. So, they turned north. During the long ride home, Genghis wasn't just idling. He was building a state. He set up a new administration, appointing darugachi, tax collectors, and local officials to govern these vast new lands. He even summoned a famous Taoist monk, Changchun, all the way to the Hindu Kush mountains to ask him about the secret of eternal life. The monk told him there was no magic elixir, only sexual abstinence and preserving one's energy. Genghis didn't like the abstinence part, but he respected the monk enough to grant tax exemptions to all Taoist monks. But there was one loose end: the Western Shia. Remember them? The first people Genghis conquered? Well, when Genghis asked for troops to fight the Khwarezmians back in 1219, the Western Shia said no. They essentially said, if you're strong enough to be Khan, fight your own wars. Genghis never forgot a slight. He returned to Mongolia in 1225. He spent a year prepping. In early 1226, he launched his final campaign. It was brutal. He sacked the cities of the Gansu corridor one by one. By late 1226, they were besieging the Shia capital. But then, disaster struck. In the winter of 1226, while hunting wild horses, Genghis was thrown from his mount. He suffered severe internal injuries. He developed a high fever. His sons begged him to go home and recover. Genghis refused. He said if he left now, The Tangut people of the Jia would think he was afraid. He pressed the attack from his sickbed. By August 1227, the Great Khan was dying. The cause is debated. Some sources say it was the fall from the horse, others say malaria, typhus, or even an arrow wound. There's a famous legend that a Tangut queen, captured for his harem, used a hidden dagger to castrate him during sex, causing him to bleed to death. But that's likely just a story. On August 18th or 25, 1227, Genghis Khan died. He was about 65 years old. His death was the empire's most guarded secret. The siege of the Shia capital was still ongoing. If the enemy knew the Khan was dead, they might rally. So, the generals kept it quiet. When the Shia finally surrendered a month later, the Mongols, fueled by grief and rage, slaughtered the entire population. The Western Shia civilization was effectively extinguished, an act of ethnocide. Genghis's body was carried back to Mongolia. Every person the funeral procession passed on the road was killed to keep the location secret. He was buried near the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain, in a place he had chosen years before. To this day, no one knows exactly where he lies, but a king is dead. Who wears the crown? Mongol succession wasn't simple. Usually the youngest son, the Ochigin or Hearthkeeper, inherited the father's property. But the title of Great Khan, that was up for grabs. Genghis had 4 sons with his chief wife Borte. First was Yochi, the eldest. But remember the kidnapping of Borte by the Merkits? Rumors had always swirled that Yochi was a Merkit bastard. He and Genghis had grown estranged. Yochi had died of an illness just months before Genghis, so he was out. Second was Chagatai. He was a strict traditionalist, an expert on Mongol law, but he was arrogant, hot-tempered, and hated Yochi with a passion. Genghis thought he was too rigid to rule. Fourth was Tolui, the youngest, a military genius. He had destroyed Khorasan. He commanded the loyalty of the army. By tradition, he should have held the most sway. But Genghis chose the third son, Ögedei. Why? Because Ögedei was the diplomat. He was a heavy drinker, excessive even for a Mongol, but he was generous, charismatic, and the only one who could stop his brothers from killing each other. He was a compromise candidate. However, when Genghis died, Tolui was in charge as regent. He held all the military power. For 2 years, there was no Khan. Tolui stalled. He had the support of Yochi's family. He could have seized the throne. But the advisor, Yelu Chuchai, convinced him that civil war would destroy everything their father built. In 1229, Tolui finally convened the Kurultai. He stepped aside, and Ögedei was crowned the second Great Khan. The empire had survived the death of its founder. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history. But if you think the conquests stopped with Genghis, you are very, very wrong. Ögedei might have been the nice brother, but he had inherited a war machine that didn't know how to stop. The Mongols were looking west again, toward Russia, toward the Middle East, toward Europe. Genghis built the house. His sons were about to set the world on fire. But the worst was yet to come. But if you think the conquest stopped with Genghis, you are very, very wrong. Ögedei might have been the nice brother, but he had inherited a war machine that didn't know how to stop. The Mongols were looking west again, toward Russia, toward the Middle East, toward Europe. Genghis built the house. His sons were about to set the world on fire. But before we watch the world burn, we need to look at who was actually holding the matches. Because Genghis Khan didn't just build an empire of dirt and horses. He built a dynasty of flesh and blood. And the way he managed his family was just as calculated, just as ruthless, and just as brilliant as his military campaigns. It all comes back to Berta. Remember her, the woman kidnapped in part 1. The woman Genghis started a world war to get back. She remained his senior wife, the empress, until the very end. They married around 1178, and despite everything, the wars, the other wives, the endless travel, she was the anchor. Together, they had 4 sons and 5 daughters, and every single one of them became a titan in their own right. Genghis didn't just let his kids sit around eating grapes, he used them. He granted Berta's sons massive territories through something called the appanage system, basically carving up the world into personal fiefdoms for his boys. But he didn't forget the girls. In fact, some historians argue his daughters were the secret weapon. He married them off to seal critical alliances, effectively ruling through his sons-in-law. Let's look at the roster, because these names shape the next 3 centuries of human history. First, the daughters. There was Kojin, born around 1179. Genghis married her to Butu of the Ikiris tribe. This wasn't a random match. Butu was one of Temujin's earliest supporters and a widower of his sister. It kept the inner circle tight. Then Chechiagan, born in 1188. She was married to Turelchi to secure the loyalty of the Oirats in the north. Alaka, born in 1190, was basically the diplomat of the family, marrying into the Ongud tribe. Tumalun, born in 1192, secured the Ongirat tribe. And finally, Al-Altan, born around 1196. She married the powerful Uyghur ruler Barchuk. But her story has a dark ending. Decades later, in the 1240s, shortly after a new Khan named Guyuk took power, Al-Altan was tried and executed on charges that were later suppressed. Even royal blood couldn't save you from Mongol politics. Now, the sons, the ones who would tear the world apart. First, there was Yoki, born around 1182. We talked about him. He was born after Berta's kidnapping. Was he Genghis's son? Was he a Merkit bastard? Genghis always accepted him as legitimate, but the whispers never stopped. Yoki actually died before Genghis did, but his appanage, his slice of the inheritance, was the land along the Irtysh River extending into Siberia. This territory would evolve into the terrifying Golden Horde that crushed Russia. Second was Chagatai, born around 1184. He was the strict one, the keeper of the law. He got the former Kara Kitai territories in Turkestan. His realm became the Chagatai Khanate. Third was Ogadei, born in 1186, the successor, the one Genghis picked to rule it all. He received lands in Dzungaria, but his real inheritance was the throne. And finally, the youngest, Tolui, born in 1193. Following Mongol tradition, the youngest son is the keeper of the hearth. He inherited the homeland, the lands near the Altai Mountains. But Tolui's legacy is arguably the biggest. 2 of his sons, Mungke and Kublai, would later rule the entire empire, and another son, Hulagu, would burn Baghdad and found the Ilkhanate. But here's the thing. Berta wasn't the only one. After Berta stopped having children, Genghis went on a bit of a spree. He began acquiring junior wives through conquest. And this wasn't just lust, it was political domination. These women were princesses and queens of the nations he destroyed. By marrying them, he was physically demonstrating that he had taken their nations. He married the Kerit princess Ibaka. He married the Tatar sisters, Yesugen and Yesui. He married Kulan, a Merkit. He even married Gurbizu, the queen of the Naiman Khan, the woman who had once insulted the Mongols for smelling bad. He took 2 Chinese princesses, Chaka of the Western Xia and Chigwo of the Jin. But make no mistake, this was a hierarchy. The children of these junior wives were always subservient to Berta's kids. Kulan had a son named Kulgan, but he was never even considered for the throne. So, we know his family. But what about the man himself? Here is the wildest fact about the most famous conqueror in history. We have no idea what he looked like. There are no paintings from his lifetime, no statues, no eyewitness sketches, nothing. We only have two descriptions from people who were actually around back then, and they are different. A Persian chronicler named Juzjani said Genghis was tall, strong, had cat's eyes, and surprisingly had no grey hair, even in old age. Meanwhile, a Song dynasty diplomat named Zhao Hong described him with a broad brow and a long beard. The secret history of the Mongols mentions that when Berta's father first met him, he noticed Temujin's flashing eyes and lively face. That's it. That's all we have. But while his face is a mystery, his personality is becoming clearer to historians. Scholars like Christopher Atwood suggest that Genghis's values came directly from that traumatic childhood we talked about in Part 1. He was obsessed with an orderly society because he grew up in chaos. He valued loyalty above literally everything else. Mutual fidelity was the cornerstone of his new nation, and he was incredibly charismatic. You don't convince thousands of people to leave their tribes and follow a homeless teenager unless you have serious magnetism. But here is where he differed from other kings. If you earned his trust, he gave you his total confidence. He was famous for his generosity. At the Great Kurultai of 1206, the men he honored the most weren't the rich princes. They were the guys who had been with him since the beginning. The guys who drank the muddy water of Baljuna with him when he had nothing. He even set up a social safety net. He took responsibility for the families of his Nukod companions who were killed in battle. He raised a tax specifically to provide clothes and food for them, and he famously hated luxury. He sent a letter to a Taoist monk named Changchun that gives us a rare glimpse into his mind. Listen to this. Heaven grew weary of the excessive pride and luxury in China. I am from the barbaric north. I wear the same clothing and eat the same food as the cowherds and horse herders. We make the same sacrifices and we share our riches. I look upon the nation as a newborn child, and I care for my soldiers as if they were my brothers. This wasn't just talk. In steppe warfare, the leader usually took the lion's share of the loot. Genghis didn't. He divided the plunder equally between himself and his men. He hated suck-ups. He objected to obsequious flattery. He told his companions to call him by his name, not fancy titles. He asked them to give him advice and, crucially, to criticize his mistakes. Think about that. The most powerful man on earth asking his subordinates to tell him when he messed up. He was obsessed with learning. He knew he was an illiterate nomad, so he outsourced the knowledge. He hired Muslim engineers for siege weapons. He captured a scribe named Tata Tonga to adapt the Uyghur alphabet for the Mongol language. He hired legal and commercial experts. He knew he didn't know everything, so he found people who did. Now, militarily, modern historians agree on something surprising. Genghis Khan probably wasn't a tactical genius in the traditional sense. We don't have records of him pulling off complex maneuvers personally. His superpower was talent scouting. He built a meritocracy. He didn't care who your dad was. If you could lead, you led. This gave the Mongol army a massive advantage over armies led by inbred aristocrats. The army wasn't technologically advanced, but it was disciplined. Draconian discipline. They mastered psychological warfare. They gathered intelligence like the CIA, and they were ruthless. Genghis believed in the steppe code of justice called Achikari Ulku, good for good, evil for evil. If you helped him, he would make you rich. If you crossed him, he would erase you. When Muhammad of Khwarazm executed his envoys, Genghis didn't just want a military victory. He wanted vengeance. That need for revenge overrode everything. Why was he so sure of himself? Religion. Genghis came to believe that the supreme deity, Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had ordained a destiny for him. At first, he just thought he was supposed to rule Mongolia. But as he kept winning, the ambition grew. He and his followers believed he possessed Su, divine grace. He believed he had an intimate connection with heaven. This meant that anyone who resisted him wasn't just an enemy of the state. They were an enemy of God. This belief allowed him to rationalize pretty much anything, including killing his blood brother, Jamukha. In his mind, it wasn't betrayal, it was destiny. So, how do we judge this guy? Genghis Khan left a legacy so big and so controversial that we are still fighting about it 800 years later. In the mid-1990s, the Washington Post named him the Man of the Millennium. They said he embodied the half-civilized, half-savage duality of the human race. And that's the perfect word, duality. On one hand, Atwood notes that he permanently altered the world view of European, Islamic, and East Asian civilizations. He created the largest contiguous land empire in history. He built a trading system that connected the world like never before. He established the rule of law. He reorganized the legal system under his adopted brother, Shigi Kutuku. On the other hand, the bodies. His conquests were brutal. He devastated China, Central Asia, and Persia. We are talking about multi-generational trauma. Whole civilizations were wiped off the map. And his biggest failure? The succession. By dividing his empire into appanages for his sons to ensure stability, he actually guaranteed that they would drift apart. The empire eventually fractured into the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty. The world remembers him in very different ways depending on where you stand. In Mongolia, for centuries, he was a religious figure, not a political one. He was deified. He became an incarnation of a Chakravartin, an ideal ruler, or the Bodhisattva Vajrapani. He was the focus of a sleeping hero legend. The idea that he would return to save his people in their darkest hour. But in the 20th century, things got complicated. When the Soviets exerted influence over Mongolia, they hated Genghis. To the communists, he was a feudal and reactionary lord who exploited the people. They repressed his cult. They replaced his alphabet with Cyrillic. In 1962, when Mongolians tried to celebrate his 800th birthday, the Soviets shut it down and cancelled the party. But then came the 1990s. The Soviet Union fell, democracy arrived, and Genghis came roaring back. Lenin Avenue in Ulaanbaatar, renamed Genghis Khan Avenue. The airport, Genghis Khan International Airport. The money? His face is on the banknotes. Brands of vodka, toilet paper, Genghis everywhere. In 2006, the parliament actually had to discuss if his name was being trivialized by too much advertising. Today, Mongolians see him as the father of the nation, the man who brought rule of law and democracy, not just war. In the Muslim world, it's complicated. At first, Muslims thought he was the literal sign of Judgment Day, the apocalypse. Then, as his descendants converted to Islam, the narrative shifted. He became seen as an instrument of God meant to cleanse corruption. Later, he became a source of political legitimacy. If you wanted to rule in Central Asia, you had to be descended from Genghis. The great conqueror Timur, Tamerlane, wasn't related to Genghis, so he had to marry Genghis's descendants and create fake genealogies just to be taken seriously. Even Babur, who founded the Mughal Empire in India, claimed authority through his descent from Genghis. But today, with the rise of Arab nationalism, the view has swung back. He is the accursed enemy, the barbarian savage who destroyed the civilization of Baghdad. In China, the Yuan dynasty, founded by his grandson Kublai, revered him as the creator of the nation. The Qing dynasty positioned themselves as his heirs. Even today, despite the trauma of the past, modern Chinese historiography often portrays him as a Chinese hero and a unifier. In the West, we've been all over the place. In the 14th century, Chaucer wrote about him as a wise king. In the 18th century, he was the stereotype of an Oriental despot. By the 20th century, he was just a barbarian warlord. Only recently have we started to see him as a complex human being. We have looked at his family. We have looked at his mind. We have looked at his ghost haunting the last 8 centuries. But we have skipped one very important detail. All of this legacy, all of these statues, all of these arguments, they all rely on the fact that he died. Genghis Khan was getting old. He had conquered the world. He had set up his succession. He had codified his laws. But there was one loose end, one kingdom that had defied him, the Western Shia. The very first kingdom he had attacked decades ago had failed to send troops for his Western campaign. They had broken their contract. Genghis Khan believed in Achikari Ulku, evil for evil. In 1227, despite being in his 60s, despite the bad omens, Genghis Khan mounted his horse one last time. He rode out to punish the Western Shia. He rode out to finish the job. But the worst was yet to come. Video intro plays, low, droning throats singing overlaid with the sound of wind whipping across the steppe. The map of the Mongol Empire burns away to reveal a single aging man on a horse. The year is 1227. Genghis Khan is 65 years old. In the 13th century, that is ancient. He has conquered more of the known world than anyone in human history. He has crushed the Shah of Khwarezm, humbled the Jin dynasty, and united the steppe. But he isn't done. Remember the Western Shah, that kingdom that refused to send troops, the ones who broke the contract? Genghis Khan never forgets a debt, and he never forgets an insult. He rides out. But this campaign feels different. The secret history tells us that during a hunt, Genghis was thrown from his horse. He was injured internally, badly. His sons begged him to go back, to rest, to let the Western Ji live another day. His response? No. He said, "If I die, I die, but I will not let them say I was weak." He pushes on. The Western Shia are decimated. Their cities burn. Their culture is all but erased from the history books. But as the victory bells ring, the great Khan is fading. And this brings us to the end of the man and the beginning of the myth. Because even in death, Genghis Khan had secrets. Now, before we get to the moment he takes his last breath, we need to pause. We need to look at the evidence. Throughout this entire series, we've been building a picture of this man. But here is the crazy part. Almost everything we know about him comes from people who hated him, or people who wrote about him long after he was dead. But there is one exception, one smoking gun. If you dig into the archives, you find a text called the Mengda Beilu. In English, that translates to a complete record of the Mongol Tartars. This isn't a legend. This isn't a poem. This is a field report. It was written by a man named Zhao Hong, also transliterated as Zhao Gong. And here is why he matters. Zhao Hong is the only surviving source who actually visited the Mongols and wrote about them while Genghis Khan was still alive. The year was 1221. While Genghis was off campaigning in Khorasan, tearing through the Middle East, Zhao Hong traveled to Mongolia as a diplomat from the Song dynasty. He walked among them. He saw their tents. He smelled the smoke of their fires. And thanks to him, we get a glimpse of the reality behind the terror. He describes Genghis not as a monster, but as a disciplined, aging warrior. He describes a man who possessed a magnetic charisma that terrified his generals. But Zhao Hong wasn't the only one watching. There was also a Persian historian named Juzjani. Now, Juzjani is interesting because he was writing 30 years after Genghis's death. But he wasn't just making things up. He relied on eyewitnesses, old men who had survived the campaign in Khorasan. Juzjani gives us the physical description that haunts historians. He says Genghis had cat's eyes and grey hair. He describes a man of immense physical power, even in old age. These two sources, Zhao Hong and Juzjani, are the anchors. Without them, Genghis is just a ghost story. With them, he's flesh and blood. And speaking of names, we need to address the elephant in the room. For 6 videos, I've been calling him Genghis Khan. You've been hearing Genghis Khan. But if you traveled back to 1227 and shouted, Genghis, nobody would know who you were talking about. In the West, we pronounce it with a soft G or a J sound, Genghis Khan. But in Mongolia, it's hard, it's guttural, it's G, Genghis Khan. The title itself is a mystery. Scholars have been arguing about it for 800 years. Some say Genghis means oceanic, implying he was the ruler of the universe as vast as the sea. Others say it comes from a word meaning fierce or hard. But the name isn't the only confusion. Let's talk about his people. We call them the Mongols. But here's the twist. At this point in time, specifically when Temujin was rising up, the word Mongols didn't refer to everyone on the steppe. Mongol was just one tribe in northeast Mongolia, just one. There were the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Kerites. They were all distinct nations. They hated each other. They killed each other. Because that one tribe, the Mongols, played the central role in the formation of the empire, their name cannibalized the rest. Temujin didn't just conquer these other tribes, he absorbed them. He took the name of his specific clan and plastered it over a massive, multi-ethnic confederation. By 1227, if you were in the army, you were a Mongol. It didn't matter if you were born a Tatar or a Turk. The identity had shifted. So, how did he do it? How did he hold this patchwork of enemies together? It comes back to that rivalry we talked about in part 2. The rivalry with Jamukha. History is written by the victors, and the secret history of the Mongols paints Jamukha as the villain. But if you look closely at the text, you see a clash of philosophies that explains everything. According to the secret history, there was a moment before the split where Jamukha turned to Temujin and said something cryptic. He said, "If we camp close to the hill, those who herd our horses will have their tents. If we camp beside the mountain stream, those who herd our sheep and lambs will have food for their gullets." Sounds like casual camping advice, right? Wrong. This was code. Jamukha was an aristocrat. He favored the hill, the high ground, the tradition, the nobility. He cared about the horse herders, the warrior caste. Temujin, he was the man of the stream. He cared for the sheep and lamb herders, the common people, the nobodies. This quote encapsulates the entire revolution. Genghis Khan won because he rejected the hill. He rejected the idea that your birth determined your worth. He built an empire for the people by the stream. But, and this is a massive but, don't mistake his populism for mercy. We cannot end this story without acknowledging the darkness. Genghis Khan liberated the common people. Yes, He created religious freedom, yes. He established the rule of law, yes. But if you crossed him, if you rebelled, let's look at Herat. Herat was a jewel of a city in modern-day Afghanistan. Initially, during the war with Khwarezm, the city surrendered to Tolui, Genghis's youngest son. They opened the gates, they paid their taxes, they were spared. But then, they made a mistake. In 1222, after the Mongols moved on, Herat rebelled. They killed the Mongol governor. They thought the storm had passed. It hadn't. Genghis sent the army back. And this time, there were no negotiations. The order was absolute. The city was destroyed. The population was massacred. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Gone. Erased. This was the duality of the great Khan. He could be the most generous ruler on earth, or the angel of death. There was no middle ground. Back to 1227. The Western Shia are defeated. The revenge is complete. And somewhere near the Yellow River, surrounded by his generals, surrounded by the sons who would carry his legacy, Genghis Khan takes his final breath. The cause of death is still debated. The crash from the horse, malaria, an arrow to the knee, we will never know for sure. But what happened next changed the world forever. You might think the empire would collapse. That's what usually happens when a charismatic warlord dies. Alexander the Great's empire fell apart the moment he died. Attila the Hun's empire evaporated. But Genghis had built a system. He left behind a lineage that would dominate Eurasia for centuries. Look at the family tree. The subjects of his legacy include a who's who of world history. Ugadai, his third son, became the great Khan and pushed the empire into Europe. Kublai Khan, his grandson, conquered all of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. Then you have Timur, Kulug, Buyantu, Rincinbal. These aren't just names in a footnote. These men ruled the largest contiguous land empire in history. And the legacy went even further than that. Centuries later, in India, a group of northern invaders would sweep down and establish one of the greatest empires the subcontinent had ever seen. They called themselves the Mughals. Does that word sound familiar? Mughal, Mongol. The word Mughal is literally the Persian Arabic derivation of Mongol. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, claimed direct descent from Genghis Khan. The Taj Mahal, that exists because of the ripple effect of Genghis Khan's DNA. So, why does this story feel so dangerous even today? Because Genghis Khan is not just a historical figure, he is a symbol. And symbols are powerful. Jump forward to the 20th century, 1962. The world is in the grip of the Cold War. Mongolia is a satellite state of the Soviet Union. 1962 marked the 800th anniversary of Temujin's birth. The Mongolian People's Republic wanted to celebrate. They wanted to issue stamps. They wanted to build a monument at his birthplace. They wanted to honor the father of their nation. But the Soviet Union said no. Moscow was terrified of Genghis Khan. They were terrified of pan-Mongolism. They were scared that if the Mongols remembered who they used to be, if they remembered that they once ruled Russia, they might get ideas. The celebration was suppressed. The scholars who organized it were purged. The stamps were destroyed. Think about that. 735 years after his death, Genghis Khan was still so terrifying that a nuclear superpower tried to erase his birthday. But they couldn't erase him. Today, if you go to Mongolia, he is everywhere. On the money, on the vodka, on the airport. A massive silver statue of him rides across the steppe, looking east toward the sunrise. But there is one thing we still don't have: his body. The funeral procession of Genghis Khan is the stuff of nightmares. Legend says that as they carried his body back to the sacred mountain of Burkan Khaldun, the soldiers killed every living thing they passed. People, horses, livestock. They wanted no witnesses. They buried him in an unmarked grave. Some say they diverted a river to flow over it. Some say they trampled the ground with 10,000 horses until it was flat as a pancake, then planted trees so it looked like the rest of the forest. Archaeologists have looked. Satellites have scanned the mountains. Billionaires have funded expeditions. They have found nothing. And honestly, that's exactly how he wanted it. He didn't build pyramids. He didn't build stone temples to his own vanity. He didn't want you to worship his bones. He wanted you to look at the world he built. From the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the humid jungles of India. He took a scattered collection of warring tribes and forged them into a hammer that shattered the medieval world. He created the first truly globalized society. He opened the Silk Road. He connected East and West. He was a monster. He was a genius. He was a liberator. He was a tyrant. He was Temujin of the Borjigin. And 800 years later, we are still living in the world he made. Video fades to black. Text on screen. End.